our, of course, a little bit of a mix-up while ago in our devotional meeting. Ian couldn't tell if it was a 4 or a 9. Now, just to tell you the truth, my old eyes could see that it was clearly a 9, but I guess when he read it, he thought this ain't got nothing to do with nothing. And of course it don't, except in here, you know. And, you know, that is a challenge to try to get a passage of Scripture that maybe piques your interest to a certain degree, even if you're not in the class that's dealing with that. And of course, I guess you'd have to have a little bit of a knowledge of history when you would see a passage that would talk about Tyre sitting out in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea and so-called protected in that position, and then being brought low and burnt to a crisp. Then that's the prophecy that we read back in Zechariah. And of course, we're going to be studying how that was actually fulfilled. And as a matter of fact, I'd say it's within the last 2 years I actually saw that portrayed on the movie screen in the midst of some movie. I don't even know what the movie was, didn't see all the movie, but I do know that they were building their little causeway out there to the island so that they could take it. Now, can you imagine doing that? Can you imagine here's a city sitting like an island, and then you're throwing stuff in the Mediterranean Sea till it builds up where you finally can carry your soldiers across? Even with modern machinery, it'd be a hard thing to do, but better they did it back then. And of course, Alexander the Great was responsible for that. And of course, soldiers were not thought of that well. So no telling how many ended up dying. If you can imagine trying to make your way out there and live at the same time, it was a very difficult task for sure, and goes down in history as being one of the most remarkable accomplishments ever. Of course, if you got enough people, then finally you can pile people up that high, you know, walk across dirt bikes. And that, of course, is what happened. What I want us to begin with this morning is on page number 15. Make one point or two about the Medes and the Persians, and realizing that, of course, when we're dealing with Old Testament history and we're dealing with between the Testaments, we're dealing with a time frame in which we know what the children of Israel, the descendants of Abraham through Isaac through Jacob, we know what they were living under by way of their authority. They were living under the law of Moses. And of course, that's going to continue for that group of people until the coming of the Messiah. And then, of course, with the coming of the Messiah, then there will be no more distinct laws for different peoples. There won't be children of Israel under the law of Moses. There won't be the nations throughout the world who are under law to God in some fashion, but everybody and anybody, wherever they be, will be under one law system. That's the law of Christ, the gospel. Christianity will be required of all, and that's, of course, the way it is today. Even though there's a smaller minority, of course, in the world that believe that, it does not deny the truth and cannot indeed stand on its own without the authority of the Word of God. But there were different times down through history in which different things happened to people who were not Jews, who were not the descendants of Jacob, that stand out in history because of there being a standard of morality that existed that people recognized even though they weren't living under the law of Moses. Remember, we talked about, I think on Wednesday evening, how that during this period of time of the Medes and the Persians, there was a woman who happened to be a Jew who ends up becoming the queen of the Medo-Persian Empire. And of course, her name was Esther. And how that all came about, of course, was the queen, Vashti, refused to expose her beauty before a bunch of drunks that her husband had a party for. And so they're all drinking and war stories and all that, you know. And he's shown all of these people to impress them all that he's got. And the only thing he hasn't shown them is his wife. And he tells her to come in with a royal crown on and show them how beautiful she is. And there's some indication in the text there that what he's wanting her to do is come in with just the crown on. And she refused to do it. Now, even if she was fully clothed, she's not going to parade before these bunch of drunks as if that's the right thing to do. She has a degree of modesty to her, of all things. But she's not a Jew. She's not living under the law of Moses. But she understood a principle of modesty that all mankind has been accountable to since the very beginning. She understood that. Now, somebody said, well, where did she pick that up at? Well, how was it that God's law was made known to others other than the children of Israel? Through the fathers. Remember, under the patriarchal age, sometimes we think about the patriarchal age, it lasts until Sinai, and then it goes out of existence and the law of Moses can. But the only problem with that is that if you take that position, then what about those people who were not Jews? They're not under the law of Moses. They're not required to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, They're not required to do all those things that were peculiar to the nation of Israel, but yet they were under law to God. And of course, Romans chapter 2 deals with that to a certain degree in explaining how that there was law that was understood by people, morality. It's always been wrong to kill. Now, I'll take that back. It's always been wrong to murder. I'll say that. It's not always been wrong to kill. There's justifiable homicide. There's justifiable capital punishment. But it's always been wrong to commit adultery. It's always been wrong to lie. There's certain things that just, as human beings, are contrary to what God holds us responsible to do. And while it's not spelled out in specific detail, then without a doubt, mankind understood that and sought to live according to those standards in harmony with God as they understood it. You remember in Romans chapter 1, in Romans chapter 1, when Paul is talking about the sins of the Gentile world, he said the reason why they participated in these things is because they refused to retain a knowledge of God in their minds. And they ended up failing to recognize the existence of God just by examining the created world. And he refers to them as being without excuse. Now think about that. Here were non-Jews who God held responsible for examining the universe and seeing from an examination of the universe there has to be a creator God behind all this. The design that exists in this world did not happen by chance. And if it didn't happen by chance, how did it arrive like this? Is there a higher power than we that we must give homage to, that we should recognize and hunt him out because he is there to be found? And that's exactly what Paul says as he's preaching to a bunch of smart people in Athens in Acts chapter 17. He says, God made himself and made man to seek after him, and he's not far from any one of us. Therefore, we should seek God. And here's the way it's always been. If here's an individual who's seeking God, providentially, that person will be able to find God and have access to God's revelation. Now, sometimes it happened from examples throughout the Old Testament and New as well, where you have individuals who proselyted in the Jews' religion, but some who didn't still live to a higher standard than the rest of the heathens, because they recognized this moral obligation that rested on their shoulders. And of course, we're going to be looking too a little bit at some of these Greek philosophers and their contribution to it all. And we're not going to be looking at it from the standpoint of they originated logic and reason and all, but they did bring the world to the realization that you could think and draw conclusions based upon evidence. Of course, that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden anyhow, see? But mankind had separated himself from rational thinking for so long that they need to be reminded that they could actually use their minds to come to conclusions that were warranted, see? And of course, now we've turned full circle, and now we live in a period of time in which people don't think you can know anything, except you can't know anything. And they claim to know that 100% for sure, that you can't know anything. Of course, that's self-defeating, but nonetheless, that's what happens.
In a lot of ways, the Bible to me is God explaining to us, okay, you should know these things, but let me tell you.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to tell us what we ought to be able to recognize as a natural
Exactly. Exactly. You know, it's like, you've heard me say or heard people say, we should have known that, and we could have known that even if God didn't say it, And that's right, because it naturally follows from the evidence. One other example of how this has worked, how it's always has worked. Remember when Jonah went and preached to Nineveh, his sermon was about as negative as any sermon you could ever hear, Yet 40 days and Nineveh will be destroyed or overthrown. That's it. Wasn't no invitation song or nothing, But yet, built into that pronouncement of condemnation for the way they was living, and everybody hated them, including Jonah, there was built into that the possibility for God to change his action towards them if they changed their attitude and action towards him. Isn't that amazing? What do we call that? That's repentance. Repentance, see? So even the king understood that, and obviously, because of the willingness of the king to use his mind instead of something for put a hat on or something, then his people continued to exist for another 100 years, And I guarantee you there was a whole lot of people during those 100 years that were tickled to death that somebody in the high places had repented, and so they got to grow up as free men and women under that system for that period of time. Now, of course, they ended up being destroyed anyhow, but think about all the people during that period of time who were allowed to live and to thrive and to do as they saw fit with their free moral agency, and who knows, but that some of them were brought to the realization of the God of the children of Israel and became a worshiper of him. And of course, who's to know? It's like when Mordecai told Esther, who knows? This may be the very reason why you happen to be the queen of the Medo-Persian Empire right now. Think about it, little girl. You're a Jew, and here you are, from these circumstances, in the position where you can save your people. Who knows? Well, the answer to that question is God does. Now, we don't always, but God knows, Have you ever seen yourself in a situation in which you thought, maybe looking back 20/20 hindsight, I was there just for that situation? If I had failed to do what I should have done in that situation, it turned out a whole lot different, Who knows? Well, God does.
It wasn't just a choice of her speaking up, it was actually a choice of her maybe getting killed.
Exactly. She had a personal part in this speaking up to the king, because she was going to end up being dead too. And Mordecai brought that to her attention. Said, that since you're a Jew, and if Haman has his way, then all the Jews, including you, do you think you're going to be safe in the king's house? No, because remember we noted the law of the Medes and the Persians, which had to be connected somehow to a whole lot of pride, that if a law was on the books, it could not be denied, but yet you could write another law that would countermand that one, and of course that's ends up what happens.
Was it illegal, or was it
Excuse me.
lawful for her to present herself to the king also the way she did?
Yes, the only way that she could respond to the king was if he told her to come on, And so when she walked in, of course, you have to look into it as well. Had she done anything up to that point in time that would have made Artaxerxes say, this is a good opportunity for me to get rid of this woman and get me another? Well, he didn't, He looked on her with favor, allowed her to come in, even though she could have had her head chopped off right there. And then she told the king what she needed. And that, of course, is taking place during this period of time in which God's silent, All right. On page number 15, concerning this religion, that's obviously it's not Judaism, it's not Christianity, but it's referred to as Zoroastrianism, okay? But built into, and maybe you didn't realize how much this influence made its way into Walt Disney cartoons, but if you read this, then you realize it did. Maybe they didn't realize they were actually teaching Zoroastrianism, but they were. this Zoroastrianism, which was a religion that originated in Iran, that's understandable too. This is way, way, way before there's any such thing as a Muslim, for sure. In this, he believed in a dualism in which Ahura Mazda, or Ormuzd, headed the gods of goodness, and then the other god headed the gods of evil. And so, have you ever seen those cartoons? You got a little devil on one shoulder and a little angel on the other shoulder, you know? And you're battling out, which one? Who's going to win out? And it's not really left up to the individual, you know. It's whoever's the most powerful influence, see. Now, the fact of the matter is that in every situation we find ourselves, and it truly is a choice between good and evil, we have the power of choice, you know. There's competing ideas and competing possibilities that go along with the decisions we make, but we make the choice. So, but based upon that mentality, during the Medo-Persian Empire, the Jews had it good because the kings, plural, wanted to abide by the little old angel sitting on the shoulder instead of the little devil sitting on the shoulder. See? They wanted to abide by good things, right things. And so they were very helpful and beneficial to the Jews' religion. Now, that don't mean that they didn't have to pay a tax, you know, or they didn't have to pay tribute. They had to do all that, but as we've stated before, they were allowed to practice their religion as they saw, whatever it was, you know. I mean, there's more people that's in captivity to them than just Jews, you know. And whoever it was, they were allowed to practice their own personal religion as long as, you know, it didn't countermand the law of the Medes and the Persians. And of course, is that not what we desire in any and every country in the world? Well, sure it is. We call it freedom, don't we? The freedom to practice any religion, the freedom to practice no religion at all. But yet we see how far people have stretched that, you know, to the point of being allowed if you're incarcerated, to sacrifice a goat, you know, because it happens to be in your religion, you got to sacrifice goats. And people bend over backwards to allow people the perspective of being able to worship the way they want to, even incarcerated. And all that goes along, you know, that we're seeing in our world today, except when it comes to Christianity. Then you ain't got no rights, sadly. And that's where it's got to in this country. And I'm overstating it to a degree, but not that much. Because how many times have you heard anything on the news about Christians, and not genuine New Testament Christians, but people claiming to be Christians throughout the world, being persecuted, killed, burned at the stake because they were claiming to follow Christ? That simply don't make the even news. Now, if a Muslim is persecuted in some way, you know, somebody pulls his beard or pulls his hat off or something, then that's front page news. Or, and even along with quote-unquote Christianity, Judaism fits in that same category. How many times do we see it, except in the United States of America, the persecution that presently is being felt by those who happen to live over in the Middle East and call themselves Jews, call themselves Israel. That happens all the time. But yet it don't make the front page news, sadly. Now, we don't want to lump together as if it's the same thing. And even you'll hear people say this, you know, they'll talk about the United States of America being based upon Judeo-Christian ethical system. Well, that's not accurate, because there ain't no Judeo in the ethical system that this country was built on. It's Christian. It's Christian, not Judeo. And somebody says, well, you can't separate Christianity from Judaism. Well, you can do. That's why we got a dividing line in our Bible, you know. And while there are, of course, many of the same things that are a part of God's revelation to the Jews, to say that the founding fathers were concerned about the law of Moses is simply not the case at all. They were concerned and sought to hold up the ethics of Christ and not the ethics of the Jews. So, notice here, number 3 under that letter G, influenced by the moral teachings of his religion, Cyrus II was known for his humane attitude towards conquered peoples. I mean, it's bad enough that they've been carried into captivity, but allowing them to do what they wanted to do religiously was a common sense way to keep people under control, you know. Just from the standpoint of you don't have near as many rights if you let them do what they want to do, in that regard, as long as they keep on bringing their money. And then the last sentence, which leads us to the next section, the Medo-Persian Empire ruled in Asia until it was conquered by Alexander the Great. And of course, after Alexander the Great died, then the Medo-Persian Empire became a part of Syria, and later it was a part of the Persian Empire. And then you have all those funny looking names that are associated with those rulers of that empire. All right. We're getting closer to our time frame, a little bit at a time. And this one, of course, is going to apply in so many different ways to Christianity because, number one, the language. The language. Alexander the Great, as well as the Greek mind, was firmly convinced that their way of doing things was the right way to do things. Okay? And so, wherever they went, they impressed upon people becoming like them, including their language. And of course, while we're talking about, 400 years prior to Christ, by the time Christ comes on the scene, by the time John the Mercer provides the way for the Lord and everything, the common language of the market is still Greek. Our New Testament is written in Koine Greek, Old Greek, not Greek like it's spoke by Andes, you know, but Old Greek, a language that is now dead. And there, even in that, we see God's providence at work, because if you've got a language that hasn't changed since it was used in the first century, then you don't have to worry about terms changing in definition from as they were used then. Because and when you say dead, then that makes it sound like it's not alive. But the fact is, it's not taking the strides into modern language like English is. You know, think about English, you know. There was a time, believe it or not, in the not too distant past, in which ain't wasn't a good word, you know. Now it's in the dictionary. And the English teachers around the world are upset, you know, especially English teachers. One time I was accused of using a triple negative. And it wasn't a math class either, you know. And in this triple negative, I simply responded to the one that brought it to my attention. And they said to me, Freddie, English is an evolving language, and you're simply pushing it, you know, to evolve. I didn't say where it was pushing it forward or backwards. I don't know which one. But that's not the way it is with Greek. See, it's not an evolving language. And so that gives us great comfort in the fact that when the original autographs of the New Testament were written in Greek and some little bit of Aramaic, then that language does not change. We know what it means today because it means today what it meant then, see? And that matters because we're talking about the language that God used to reveal his will for mankind until the end of the world. Now that sounds pretty important to me. And certainly it is. So notice at the beginning here, and some of this you already know, and a few things that we'll bring out maybe will be beneficial. But of course, when you start thinking about the beginnings of Greek history, then you know that a whole lot more myth than historical accuracy is involved in it, you know. Of course, that's the way it is with many ancient civilizations, you know. You got everything from talking animals to giant godlike creatures and all such as that, which of course is fictitious. But sadly, many people are more in tune with the fictitious and the fables than they are with plain old truth. And so there's a brief history of how they arose to where they were. Some of these famous battles took place, and there have been movies made about these famous battles and all. And then now, notice now in letter C, the formation of an empire was begun by a man by the name of Philip of Macedon. He was the king of Macedonia. See, Macedonia. And he laid the foundation for this empire by getting all of the city-states to join together. You got cities spread out all over the known world. They were all, you remember, an example of this type of arrangement, civics class-wise, was back when the children of Israel went into the land of Canaan, There were many metropolitan areas that were a nation unto themselves. They had a wall around the city. They had all their government officials that lived in that one city. And so when the children of Israel went in there, remember, it was the responsibility of Joshua and the army of the Israelites to defeat all those major city oppositions. And of course they did that, And then the little old smaller areas, smaller cities, then the individual tribes were given the responsibility of doing the mop-up work. Of course, they failed much of that, but that was their responsibility. You don't need a whole big old powerful army to defeat dogs, or Palo, or anything like that. So these city-states existed with a loose connection together. But what Philip did was brought them all together as one unit in different places. Now that's going to end up being very powerful when you got people who are following the same instructions in all these different areas. And especially, does this take place when he dies, and guess who ascends to the position of emperor and leader at that time? None other than old Alexander himself. And how many of you heard that Alexander the Great died when he was 32, and he died of boredom because there wasn't anything else to conquer? I can remember that all the way as far back as I can remember. And that aptly describes Alexander the Great. But you don't think of him as a 20-year-old being comparable to a 20-year-old today, because as the son of a king, much like Moses, in Egypt, he had the best of everything, the best education, the best possible training, because he's being raised to take the place of the king. Now, obviously, the king don't think it's going to be when he's that young, probably, but when he begins to lead this nation of people, then obviously he's going to be doing a tremendous task. And so you read about how they defeated all these various peoples, and then you get down to the bottom of the page, which coincides with our devotional reading, at the capture of Tyre. Remember, and here's brought to our attention back in the book of Isaiah, that Isaiah prophesied, pre-written history, that Tyre would be destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And it was. So somebody said, wait a minute, there's a contradiction in it. No. It was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, but then, in order to make themselves less vulnerable, they ended up building on an island off the coast of what had previously been Tyre, and now they felt like they were impossible to be defeated. Well, of course, that was shown not to be so, because this new city of Tyre, letter C, was built on an island offshore, but Zechariah, just as Ian read for us this morning, prophesied that this stronghold would be smitten in the sea and devoured with fire. And that's exactly what happened. And this fulfillment, now see, when we say that at this time God was silent, but we don't mean by God being silent he's not providing any more information. We don't mean that the prophecies that were made by the prophets to take place during this period of time, they still took place, And we're going to see that more and more as we get closer to the coming of John the Immerser in the gospel of Christ. And so here that was fulfilled. A siege of 7 months, 8,000 inhabitants were slain, 30,000 were sold into slavery. And the destruction of Tyre is considered the greatest military achievement of Alexander. And that says something in and of itself because of how successful he really was. Now, what's interesting here with the Greeks is up to this point in time, all of the world powers have been coming from Asia and East, Well, now the world powers are going to be more focused back towards England, back towards the West. And we still hear that terminology even today, you know, about the influence of the West. And that includes anything and everything that's west of where all this is taking place, you know. The West is the great Satan. Well, who's in the Muslim mind? You know, well, who's the West? Well, basically everybody that speaks English, and then a few Frenchmen and Germans put in there too, you see. So you got everybody, everybody the East that took place beginning here with Alexander, everything that's this way is considered the enemy of the world. And reckon why, from a practical standpoint, why do you think that Muslims would draw that conclusion? Just from a practical standpoint. To what is the world exposed about England and America? Is it good stuff or is it bad stuff? And we recognize it's bad stuff. It's bad stuff. It's bad stuff. It's the media. It's the movies. It's the television shows. When I went to, the second time I went to Moscow and got a lot closer to some of those kids then, you know, because I done knew them and all from the first visit. But those young people, those girls, they tried to dress up like and look like Madonna because they were convinced that every American mother and father would be tickled to death for their sons to bring home their future daughter-in-law and she'd look something like Madonna. They really believed that. And I said, no. I said, now there may be a good portion of our society that thinks like that, but hopefully it's in the very noticeable minority that thinks that. That's not what a good daughter-in-law looks like. It's not what you want your grandmother or that's not what you want your grandkids to be raised by as Madonna, you know. Well, they couldn't believe it because they'd drawn that conclusion from the media. Well, the same thing holds true for the Muslim world. What do they see? Sex and violence and homosexuality. I mean, just everything that's contrary to morality in itself, and certainly contrary to the morality of the Quran. They see that in the West, the United States of America, England, and everybody that's influenced by those same things. So this freedom that we have to engage in all these activities and without repercussions, you know, says a whole lot to the people who want to get rid of us because they can see us as being a threat to the morality they uphold. Of course, the morality they uphold is certainly questionable in a whole lot of different areas, you know, but that's why they look upon us like that, as if everybody in America is just like the left coast is, sadly, because they leave out the West Coast too. You know, I mean the East Coast and New York City as well. So that type of influence is felt around the world. All right. Then notice at the top of page 17, because this is where we end up start seeing some connections between the powers that be and, of course, the area in which the gospel is going to first go forth from with the capture of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is the capital city of what? Capital city of Israel, you know. It's the capital city and has been all this time. So when Alexander was so successful in his defeating of Tyre, then really there's nothing going to stand in his way. If he can do that, he can do just about anything. And then mentioned in secular writings, of course, is a fellow by the name of Sanballat, which maybe is a dynastic title because we run into none other than a Sanballat when we're studying in Nehemiah and Ezra concerning their exploits as well, and how that Sanballat led opposition to the rebuilding of the wall around the city, as well as the reestablishment of the Jews' religion in Jerusalem. And so here he is mentioned as having 7,000 soldiers that are helping him, and they end up telling the high priest to send out so much provisions for them, and the high priest says, it ain't happening on my watch. Okay. Now, that's not going to turn out too good when you got Alexander out there saying, I want food from my people, from my soldiers, and you don't send it to him. And so he went and met with the high priest. The high priest's name was Jaddua. And notice it says he saluted him, indicating that he had seen this very person, Jehuda, in a dream in Macedonia. Thus, he was believing that his army was under divine conduct. Now, there's when you start to ask, was he smoking? Well, did he really dream that he was supposed to be successful? Well, of course not, you know. But I guess if you're trying to conquer the world, then you'll end up having a whole lot of dreams that reinforce it, unless common sense somehow gets into your dreams, says you better back off and think about this first. And so what he did, he allowed the Jews to continue doing what they were doing, following the lead of what the Medo-Persians had done, and they didn't have to pay any tribute, but just on the 7th year. Isn't that amazing? And then, of course, you have the first rise of actual persecution from the Samaritans, who were those who lived in the northern kingdom, and they were a mixture of all the different peoples who had populated there after the destruction of the northern kingdom and Samaria by the Assyrians all the way back in 720 and 721 BC. So you're thinking about what happens over 300 or 400 year period of time, and then you look at America, you know. Has there been significant changes that's taken place in this country since its establishment, you know, in 1776? Well, of course, you know. So you can imagine what would have transpired with the attitude of these peoples towards each other. The Samaritans hated the Jews, Jews hated the Samaritans. Why? Well, we always have. You know, sort of like the Hatfields and McCoys, you know. Why is that? Well, we just always have. Don't you dare marry no McCoy. Don't you dare marry no, you know, back and forth, back and forth. And increasingly, there's more of that type of mentality that exists even among brethren. Why? Well, it's always have. That's not good enough. That's not good enough.
Samaritans, you know, when the children of Israel, the divided kingdom, then in the northern kingdom, they intermarried with all the pagan people, and then they set up their own worship services. The next thing you know, they've forgotten God altogether.
Exactly.
And so the division occurred about that time, I think, mainly.
Yeah.
And so then there was always animosity between the two after that.
They were considered, whether it was so or not, strictly speaking, they were considered half-breeds, you know. When in reality, they were the result of half-breeding way, way back, you know, to the time. And remember the situation in John chapter 4 when this Samaritan woman is drawing water at Jacob's well, supposedly, you know, and Jesus has a conversation with her, and she says, hey, which is the right place to worship? We, Samaritans, we worship up here on Mount Gerizim. This is the place that we're told we're supposed to worship, but the Jews say, no, you're supposed to worship in Jerusalem. Well, strictly speaking, those that were supposed to worship in Jerusalem were the descendants of Abraham through Isaac through Jacob, okay? Now, if these people were going to be faithful to their forefathers, you know, then they'd have been doing that too. Just because they intermarried with the heathen did not mean they had cast off the yoke of responsibility they had to the law of Moses, or else David wouldn't have been required to, you know, and all the others who intermarried with just about anybody, Solomon, you know, man. So they were held responsible, and that divide there, I mean, we think, here's your first, you got a conversation with the Son of God. Of course, you don't know he's the Son of God, but the first time you have an opportunity to talk to a Jewish man, this is the question that comes up. So it must have been a pretty significant question, that which divided the Samaritans from the Jews. And then, of course, increasingly so as time went on. We're completely out of time here.
But Jesus told her there too. He said, the Jews have got it right.
Exactly.
Jerusalem is the place you worship. But the time's coming when no.
It won't matter where.
Yeah.
The time's coming wherever you worship the Father in spirit, and you worship the Father in truth. Thank you so much. Whoa. Boy, we just about had a mistake. Man, that would have been amazing.